The Grand Hall of the Kethner Empire was a place of power and fear. Millions of beings from across the galaxy had gathered to witness the announcement of Supreme Alpha Vorganth. He sat on his obsidian throne, a creature of immense size and terrifying beauty. His scales shimmered like liquid metal, and his eyes burned with an ancient intelligence that had survived for thousands of years. The Kethner were apex predators, the most dangerous species in the known universe. They had conquered everything in their path, and no one dared to challenge them. HFY stood in the crowd of delegates, her small human frame barely visible among the towering aliens. She was a xenolinguist from Earth, a planet that most of the galaxy barely acknowledged. Her job was to translate for the human colony's representative, but her real passion was studying old languages and forgotten civilizations. She had spent years learning about the precursor civilization, a species that had mysteriously disappeared thousands of years ago. No one else seemed to care about the dead language called Voshal anymore. Everyone had moved on to more practical matters, but HFY was different. She had filled her personal archives with every scrap of information she could find about this ancient tongue. When Vorganth finally stood and spoke, the entire assembly fell into perfect silence. The Supreme Alpha never needed to raise his voice. Everyone simply stopped breathing when he decided to speak. "I am old," he announced. His words echoed through the massive hall. "Even the Kethner cannot escape the weight of years, and so the time has come to choose my successor. But I will not choose through combat as our traditions demand. Instead, I will choose through knowledge." The crowd murmured with confusion. Knowledge was not how the Kethner did things. Strength, cunning, and the ability to defeat enemies in battle determined who rose to power among them. Vorganth continued, his voice growing stronger. "The precursor civilization left us many things. They left us their technology, their understanding of the stars, and their warnings about the darkness that approaches. But they left their knowledge in a language that none of us remember. They left it in Voshal, the ancient dead language. Whoever among you can master this language, whoever can prove themselves fluent in every word and every meaning, will become my heir. This is my command." The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembly. Thousands of species realized they faced an impossible task. The precursors had vanished so long ago that their language had become nothing more than dusty records in forgotten archives. Some species tried to remember if they had ever studied it. The Kethner warriors looked at each other with confusion and shame. They had abandoned the study of languages generations ago, believing it a waste of their time. Warriors needed strength, not words. Commander Zorvas, one of the most powerful of the Kethner warlords, stood up and challenged the declaration. "This is madness, Supreme Alpha. How can we find someone fluent in a dead language? How can anyone possibly learn something that has not been spoken in 10,000 years? Vorganth's gaze turned to the commander, and Zorvas immediately fell silent. The Supreme Alpha did not argue. He simply stared until the warrior sat back down, defeated by the sheer force of the old leader's presence. "Anyone who can master Voshal within 6 months will become my heir," Vorganth said. "Anyone who wishes to try may come forward. The rest of you should pray that someone succeeds, because if no one does, I will choose through combat as before, and that conflict will tear the Empire apart." The assembly slowly began to disperse. HFY watched as delegates from 1,000 different worlds hurried away, already beginning to search their archives and databases for any information about the ancient language. She knew what they would find. Nothing useful. Voshal was too old, too obscure, too forgotten. But she also knew something else. She had studied Voshal extensively. She had found ancient texts that no one else had looked at. She had spent countless nights on forgotten space stations, working through old records and deciphering the patterns of the language. She understood the grammar, the pronunciation, the subtle meanings hidden within each word. She was probably the only person in the entire galaxy who had more than a passing knowledge of this ancient tongue. Heywan felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was an impossible opportunity. If she could teach the Supreme Alpha's chosen heir the language, if she could guide them through the complexities of Voshal, she could change everything. Humanity would gain influence in the Empire. The small human colony would no longer be ignored and overlooked, and perhaps most importantly, she could see the language she loved so much come alive again, spoken by someone in a position of power. But there was another option, one that terrified her even as it excited her. She could try herself, a human learning to speak like a precursor, a small, fragile creature from an insignificant world becoming fluent in the most important language in the galaxy. It was crazy. It was impossible. It was madness. Yet as Heywan watched Vorganth leave the Grand Hall, the Supreme Alpha paused for just a moment. His crimson eyes scanned the crowd. For just a fraction of a second, his gaze seemed to rest on her. Was it imagination, or did his expression shift? Did he notice her standing there? Did he sense something? Heywan's hand trembled as she reached for the communication device in her suit. She had 6 months. 6 months to prove that a human could master the language of a civilization that had disappeared before humanity even learned to walk upright. 6 months to change her destiny and the destiny of her entire species. She activated the device and spoke her message clearly and steadily, even though her hands were shaking. I volunteer to become fluent in Voshal. I request to be taken to Supreme Alpha Vorganth so that he may test my knowledge and give me the opportunity to learn. The words hung in the air. Around her, many turned to look at her with confusion and pity. A human? Trying to learn the precursor language? It was the most ridiculous thing any of them had ever heard. But Heywan did not look away. She stood tall, and she waited. Within hours, Imperial guards arrived to collect her. They did not seem angry or amused. They simply took her into custody with the same efficiency they would have used to transport cargo. As she was led away from the assembly hall, Heywan realized that her old life had ended. Whatever came next would be either triumph or catastrophe. There was no middle path. There was no simple outcome. The guards took her to a massive transport ship, and she watched through the window as the Imperial Assembly world grew smaller below her. She was flying toward her destiny, toward the fortress of Supreme Alpha Vorganth, toward a challenge that no human had ever faced before, and deep in her heart, Heywan knew that she would not fail. The fortress of Supreme Alpha Vorganth was built into the obsidian mountains of the Kethnir capital world. It was not a beautiful place. It was a place of function and power. The walls were black stone that seemed to absorb light. The halls were wide enough to allow the massive Supreme Alpha to walk comfortably. Everything about the fortress spoke of control and strength. Heywan felt very small as the guards led her through endless corridors and up flights of stairs that were far too tall for human legs to navigate comfortably. Her new quarters were surprisingly comfortable. The room was large, with high ceilings and windows that looked out over the dark mountains. There was a bed, a desk, and a collection of computer terminals that gave her access to the Imperial archives. Heywan ran her fingers across the surfaces, still not quite believing that this was real. A message appeared on one of the terminals. It was an official directive from the Supreme Alpha. She was to report to the Imperial Library at sunrise the next day. A guide would be provided. She was to bring nothing but herself. Heywan barely slept that night. She lay in the massive bed, her mind racing through everything she had studied about Voshal. The grammar rules, the pronunciation guides, the ancient texts and their meanings. She had memorized so much, but suddenly it all felt like very little. What if she had missed something important? What if her understanding was incomplete? When dawn came, a tall figure was waiting for her in the corridor outside her room. The man was Kethner, but he was different from the warriors she had seen. He was lean rather than massive, and his scales were a deeper shade of purple than most of his kind. He wore the robes of a scholar, not the armor of a soldier. "I am Tae-jun," the Kethner said. His voice was soft and measured. "I am the former imperial educator, though I have been retired for many years. Supreme Alpha Vorganth has asked me to teach you Voshal. He believes I am the only one qualified to do so. Follow me." Tae-jun led Hai-wan through the fortress to a section she had not seen before. It was filled with books. Not digital archives, but actual physical books made of paper and leather. Thousands of them, arranged on shelves that climbed toward impossibly high ceilings. The room smelled of age and knowledge. "This is the real library," Tae-jun explained. "The digital archives contain information, but they do not contain understanding. These books contain the secrets of Voshal, written by hands that lived when the precursors still walked the galaxy." "I have spent 300 years collecting them." Hai-wan's eyes went wide. 300 years? You look much younger than that." Tae-jun smiled, which was a strange expression on his reptilian face. "The Kethnir live a very long time, and I have spent much of my life searching for these texts. Even the Supreme Alpha does not know how long I have been studying this language. I kept it hidden from the warrior caste. They do not respect knowledge the way they respect power, but I always believed that someday this knowledge would matter." For the next 6 months, Hai-wan lived in the library with Tae-jun. She woke before dawn and did not sleep until long after darkness fell. The Kethner educator was a harsh teacher, but a fair one. He corrected her pronunciation with brutal honesty. If she mispronounced a word, he made her repeat it 50 times until she got it right. If she misunderstood a meaning, he would explain it in 6 different ways until she truly understood. But Tae-jun was also patient in a way that surprised her. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing something. Instead, he treated each gap in her knowledge as a puzzle to be solved. He told her stories about the precursors, bringing the ancient civilization to life through his words. He explained that Voshal was not just a language. It was a way of thinking. Every word carried philosophy within it. To speak Voshal was to understand how the precursors saw the universe. Hai-wan began to see the language differently. She stopped simply memorizing words and started understanding the ideas behind them. She learned that a single Voshal word could mean something different depending on how it was spoken, what emotions the speaker brought to it. The language was alive in a way that modern languages had forgotten how to be. Weeks passed, then months. Hai-wan's pronunciation improved dramatically. Her understanding of grammar became almost intuitive. She began to dream in Voshal, her sleeping mind processing the strange sounds and ancient meanings. But there was something else happening in the fortress. Supreme Alpha Vorganth had begun to visit her lessons. At first, he simply observed from the shadows. He would sit in a chair that had to be specially reinforced for his massive weight, and he would watch as Tae-jun taught and Hai-wan learned. Then one day, he began to correct her pronunciation. His voice was rough and harsh, a sound like grinding stone, but his corrections were precise. He remembered the language. Deep in his ancient memory, the sounds of Voshal still lived, and Hai-wan realized something important. Vorganth was not just testing her. He was remembering. He was waking something within himself that had been sleeping for thousands of years. She began to ask him questions between lessons. Why had he really demanded that the next heir speak Voshal? What was so important about this dead language? One evening, Vorganth answered her. They were alone in the library, just Hai-wan and the Supreme Alpha sitting across a table from each other. The old creature's eyes were dark with something that might have been sadness. "The precursors left warnings," he said slowly. Before they disappeared, they recorded their knowledge in Voshal. They recorded what they had discovered about the darkness at the edge of our galaxy. They recorded what was coming toward us. The Kethnir have forgotten these warnings. We have become too proud, too focused on conquest. We did not think to look backward, to learn from those who came before. But I am old. I can feel something approaching, something vast and terrible. And if my people are to survive it, we must remember what the precursors knew. HFY felt the weight of his words. She was not just learning a language for politics or advancement. She was learning it because the survival of the galaxy might depend on it. The final week before the trial arrived. HFY had learned everything that Taejun and Vorganth could teach her. She was as ready as she could possibly be. She had mastered the grammar, the pronunciation, the ancient meanings. But she also carried something else, the weight of knowing that this was not just an academic exercise. This was about survival. The night before the trial, Vorganth came to her one last time. He placed one massive clawed hand on her shoulder, a gesture that could have crushed her, but instead was surprisingly gentle. "You have done well, small human," he said. "Better than I thought possible. Tomorrow the assembly will test you. They will try to break your knowledge and prove you unworthy. But you will stand firm. You will show them that Voshal lives again. And perhaps we will all survive what is coming." HFY nodded, unable to speak. She understood now why Vorganth had chosen to seek a heir through knowledge rather than through combat. The old Supreme Alpha was not growing weak with age, he was growing wise. And tomorrow she would have to prove that she was worthy of that wisdom. The news that a human girl was learning Voshal in Vorganth's fortress spread through the Empire like poison. Some of the Kethnir warlords found it amusing. Others found it deeply offensive. Commander Zorvas, who had challenged the Supreme Alpha's decision in the Grand Assembly, was one of the most angry. He saw in HFY a threat to everything the Kethnir stood for. A tiny human woman could not possibly become the heir to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. It was an insult to their entire civilization. But Zorvas was also intelligent enough to know that direct challenge to Vorganth was suicide. The Supreme Alpha's power was absolute. So instead, he began a different kind of war. He sent assassins to the fortress. He paid mercenaries from across the galaxy to eliminate the human girl. He spread rumors that HFY was poisoning the mind of the old leader, that she was some kind of spy from an enemy civilization. He did everything in his power to make sure that she would never complete her training. On the third night of her studies in the library, HFY nearly died. A figure in dark clothing crept into her room as she slept. The assassin was quick and efficient, trained in 100 different ways to kill. His blade was poisoned with a substance that would cause death in minutes. But something saved HFY's life. A sound. A sharp, quick sound of blade meeting blade. She woke to find a young Kethnir male standing over her, his own weapon still drawn. Her assassin lay dead on the floor, his blood staining the expensive carpet. The Kethnir warrior was breathing heavily, and he looked almost as shocked as HFY felt. "Are you hurt?" he asked in a tense voice. "No," HFY managed to say. "Who are you?" "My name is Min Su," the warrior said. "Supreme Alpha Vorganth assigned me to guard you. I was waiting outside your door. This is the third attempt on your life. The fortress has been filled with assassins for the past 2 days. I have stopped them, but Vorganth is not pleased. He is preparing a response." HFY's hands were shaking as guards came and removed the dead body. Minsu waited in her room until dawn, his weapon never leaving his hand. He was lean for a Kethnir, but his movements showed years of training and countless battles. His eyes were intelligent and focused. He never looked away from the windows and doors, constantly watching for more attackers. When the sun rose, Minsu took her to speak with Vorganth. The Supreme Alpha was in a fury. His massive form seemed to fill the entire hall, and his voice shook the walls as he spoke. Zorvas had overstepped. The old leader would respond with force. He would crush anyone who threatened the trial. But HFY asked him to stop. She asked him not to kill Commander Zorvas or any of his followers. It surprised everyone in the hall. Vorganth studied her with his burning red eyes. "Why would you ask for mercy on those who try to murder you?" he demanded. "Because killing them will only make more enemies," HFY said carefully. "And because I need to prove that I can learn this language, that I can understand it in a way that shows the wisdom of the precursors." The precursors were advanced. They were wise. "If I survive by having you kill everyone who opposes me, then I have not truly earned anything. But if I can survive their attempts and still master Voshal, then I will have truly proven myself." There was a long silence. Then Vorganth laughed, that terrible grinding sound that had frightened HFY at first. "You are clever, small human. Very clever indeed. Very well. No one will be executed. But the assassins will be punished, and they will carry a message. Anyone who attempts to kill HFY will pay a terrible price." From that day forward, Minsu never left her side. He stood beside her while she studied with Taijun. He watched her practice her pronunciation. He guarded her while she slept. At first, she thought he resented the assignment, but slowly she began to notice that he was genuinely interested in what she was doing. He started asking her questions about Voshal. He wanted to understand the language, so HFY began to teach him simple phrases. Nothing complicated, just basic words and their meanings. Minsu was not a scholar like Taejun, but he was intelligent and quick to learn. More importantly, he was genuinely curious about the precursor civilization. He asked her why they had been so advanced, what had happened to them, why they had disappeared. Weeks into her training, something extraordinary happened. HFY discovered a section of the library that neither she nor Taijun had explored before. It was locked behind ancient security systems, but Minsu's soldier's intuition helped her find the way through. Inside, there were more books, older and more carefully preserved than anything she had seen yet. These books were different. They contained not just linguistic information, but diagrams and star charts. And as HFY began to translate the words written beneath the diagrams, she understood what she was looking at. These were prophecies. These were warnings about something approaching the galaxy from beyond the rim of known space. The precursors had seen something coming. Something vast and dark and terrifying. They had known that a catastrophe would eventually reach the galaxy, and they had left these messages in Voshal, hidden in their language, as a way to preserve the warning for whoever came after them. HFY's voice shook as she translated the words aloud. "The darkness approaches. It moves between stars. It consumes all light. Those who come after must be prepared. Those who come after must remember. Those who come after must not make our mistakes." As she spoke the ancient words, something miraculous happened. Holograms activated in the vault where the books were stored. Ancient projections filled the air, showing star maps of regions beyond the known galaxy. They showed patterns of destruction, entire solar systems that had been wiped out. The precursors had encountered this darkness before. They had fought it, and they had been forced to retreat, eventually disappearing entirely. When Vorganth learned what she had discovered, he came to the vault himself. The old Supreme Alpha stood before the holographic star maps, and for the first time since HFY had known him, she saw something like fear in his ancient eyes. "This is why I need you," he said softly. "This is why I demanded someone fluent in Voshal. The darkness is returning. My deepest senses have felt it for many years, but I did not have the proof. I did not have the understanding. But you have found it. You have unlocked what the precursors left behind, and now The Empire must know. We must prepare. Hei-Wan understood the enormous weight of what she had discovered. She was no longer simply a student learning an ancient language. She was the keeper of a terrible secret. The galaxy faced a threat that made all the wars and conflicts of the current age seem insignificant. And she was the only one who could understand the precursor warnings about what was coming. With Min-Su watching from the shadows and Tae-Jun's knowledge guiding her, Hei-Wan realized that her training had become something far more serious than she had ever imagined. She was not just learning Voshal. She was learning the truth about the fate of the galaxy itself. The Grand Amphitheater was packed with delegates from every major civilization in the galaxy. Thousands of creatures filled the massive arena, their various forms of life creating a strange and wonderful symphony of sounds and movements. The Kethner warriors sat in the highest seats, their massive forms casting shadows over everyone below them. Representatives from the human colonies stood nervously in a special section, hardly daring to believe that one of their own was about to compete for such an impossible position. Hei-Wan stood in the center of the amphitheater, looking tiny beneath the towering walls. Her heart was pounding so hard that she thought everyone must be able to hear it. She was dressed in simple robes, the kind that scholars wore, not the armor of warriors. Her small human body looked fragile and weak compared to the powerful beings surrounding her. The trial would test three things. First, she would recite the ancient Voshal texts from memory, proving that she had truly learned the language's words and sounds. Second, she would interpret the meanings of those texts, showing that she understood the deep philosophy behind the precursor language. Third, she would defend her interpretations against challenges from the Kethner Council of Elders, proving that her knowledge was real and complete. Supreme Alpha Vorganth sat on a throne that had been brought into the amphitheater for this occasion. His crimson eyes watched Hei-Wan with an expression that was impossible to read. Behind him sat Tae-Jun, the old educator, and Min-Su, who had positioned himself as close as possible to Hei-Wan's location. A judge, an ancient Kethner named Morkesh, who had lived longer than even Vorganth, raised his clawed hand for silence. Hei-Wan of Earth, he announced, his voice magically amplified so that every being in the amphitheater could hear. You have been given 6 months to become fluent in Voshal, the ancient dead language of the precursor civilization. Now you must prove your knowledge before this assembly. Do you understand? I understand, Hei-Wan said. Her voice was small but steady. Then begin, Morkesh commanded. Recite the founding prophecy of the precursors, the oldest text in Voshal. Hei-Wan took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. She closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering Tae-Jun's lessons, remembering the sound of Vorganth's ancient voice teaching her the proper pronunciation. Then she began to speak. The words flowed from her mouth like music, like the singing of ancient stars. The Voshal language was beautiful in a way that modern languages could never be. Each word seemed to carry weight and meaning beyond its simple definition. As Hei-Wan recited the founding prophecy, she painted a picture of the precursor civilization in its earliest days, when they had just begun to understand the universe around them. The amphitheater had fallen completely silent. No one moved. Many beings had never heard Voshal spoken before, and certainly none had expected it to sound so perfect coming from a human throat. When Hei-Wan finished the recitation, there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then, slowly, applause began. Even some of the Kethner warriors were clapping, though their claws against the stone made a sound like thunder. Judge Morkesh raised his hand again. The recitation was acceptable. Now interpret the founding prophecy. Tell us what the precursors meant when they spoke these words. This was the true test. Anyone could memorize sounds, but understanding the meaning was far more difficult. Hei-Wan explained how the precursors saw themselves as children of the universe, learning to walk among the stars. She described their philosophy of balance and harmony, of seeking knowledge while remaining humble before the vast cosmos. She talked about the precursor belief that all conscious beings were connected, that the universe was a single living entity experiencing itself through many different forms. As she spoke, the holograms in the vault below the amphitheater activated through a connection that Vorganth had secretly arranged. Images filled the sky above the arena, showing precursor texts and diagrams as HFY described them. The beings watching gasped in amazement. They could see the language she was describing, could see the ancient symbols and charts that proved her knowledge was real. But then Commander Zorvas stood up. The great Kethnir warrior rose from his seat, and his movement seemed to suck the energy from the amphitheater. He descended toward the floor of the arena, his massive form dwarfing HFY completely. "This interpretation is wrong," Zorvas announced loudly. "The precursors were not peaceful philosophers. They were warriors like us. This girl corrupts their words with weakness. She has taught herself a false understanding of Voshal." The crowd murmured with uncertainty. Zorvas was a powerful voice in the Empire, and his challenge carried weight. HFY felt fear spike through her, but she did not step back. "I respectfully disagree," she said, keeping her voice calm. "The precursor word Vorshek, which means balance, is built from two root words. Vor means strength, and Shek means flowing water. The precursors understood that true strength was not the strength of stone, which breaks. True strength was the strength of water, which bends but never breaks. This is not weakness. This is the highest form of strength." Zorvas challenged her interpretation of other passages. He demanded that she explain words in isolation, without context. He tried to find contradictions in her understanding. But HFY was prepared. Taejun had taught her well. She responded to every challenge with evidence from the ancient texts. She showed the etymological roots of Voshal words, the connections between similar words, the context in which different phrases appeared. The debate lasted for hours. Zorvas brought other Kethnir warriors to support his arguments. They attacked her interpretations from different angles, trying to confuse her or catch her in mistakes. But HFY stood firm. She did not simply defend her position. She invited them to look at the evidence themselves. She asked them to read the ancient texts. She treated them as intelligent beings capable of understanding truth when they were shown it. Slowly, the tone of the amphitheater began to change. Even some of Zorvas's own supporters started to admit that HFY's explanations made sense. Her knowledge of the language was clearly deeper and more complete than anything any of them had. She was not just translating words. She was preserving a way of thinking, a philosophy that had been lost for thousands of years. Finally, Judge Morkesh called an end to the debates. "HFY," he said, "you have demonstrated extraordinary knowledge of Voshal. Your recitation was flawless. Your interpretation shows deep understanding of the precursor philosophy, and your defenses against challenges have been thorough and logical. Commander Zorvas, do you concede that she is fluent in Voshal?" Zorvas was silent for a long moment. The great warrior looked down at the small human woman, and HFY could see the conflict in his ancient eyes. Pride warred with the undeniable truth. Finally, he spoke. "She is fluent," he said, the words seeming to pain him. "The human has mastered the language of the precursors." Supreme Alpha Vorganth rose from his throne. He descended the steps slowly, each of his massive footfalls shaking the ground. He walked to where HFY stood in the center of the amphitheater, and he lowered his great head. Then, in a gesture that shocked every being watching, Vorganth bowed. The Supreme Alpha of the Kethnir, the most powerful creature in the galaxy, was bowing to a small human girl. He raised his head and looked into her eyes. And HFY saw something in his ancient gaze that she had never expected. Respect. Deep, genuine respect. Vorganth spoke a single word in Voshal. War, which meant worthy of the stars. The amphitheater erupted. The crowd roared its approval. Even Commander Zorvas bowed, accepting the reality of what had happened. HFY had done the impossible. She had become fluent in the ancient dead language. She had earned the right to become the heir to the Supreme Alpha. And in doing so, she had changed the future of the entire galaxy. After the trial ended, HFY's life changed completely. She was no longer a student. She was officially recognized as Supreme Alpha Vorganth's chosen heir. This meant she had access to the most secret information in the entire empire. It meant that thousands of the most powerful beings in the galaxy now had to take her seriously. It also meant that she could never go back to the simple life she had known before. The first change was her living quarters. She was moved from the guest chambers to the heir's palace, a massive structure within Vorganth's fortress that had been empty for hundreds of years. The last heir had been defeated in combat, and no one had thought to prepare the space again. Now servants rushed to renovate the abandoned palace, cleaning and repairing centuries of dust and decay. But HFY barely noticed her surroundings. She was too focused on learning everything that Taijun could teach her. The old educator introduced her to deeper layers of Voshal that she had not yet studied. There were philosophical texts that explored the nature of consciousness and reality. There were scientific texts that described technologies the precursors had developed. There were historical records that told the story of the precursor civilization from its beginning to its mysterious end. Minsu remained at her side through all of this. The guard had become something more than a bodyguard. He had become a friend and confidant. He helped her understand military strategy and how empires actually functioned. He introduced her to other members of the Kethnir military, warriors who began to respect her knowledge and her willingness to learn. And gradually, HFY began to understand that she would not be ruling alone. She would need advisors and allies, military leaders, and strategic thinkers. Minsu helped her begin to build that network. But there was a darkness growing at the edges of the empire, something that demanded more and more of Vorganth's attention and resources. Fleet Commander Jin Wu, a brilliant military strategist, began bringing disturbing reports to the fortress. Deep space probes were detecting anomalous readings beyond the galactic rim. Entire regions of space were going dark. Ships sent to investigate were disappearing without sending any messages. At first, the Kethnir Council tried to ignore these reports. They believed Jin Wu was being paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. But then more evidence accumulated. Astronomical observations confirmed that something vast was moving through the darkness of space, moving toward the galaxy. Whatever it was consuming everything in its path. Vorganth brought Jin Wu to meet with HFY. The fleet commander was a powerful Kethnir female, scarred from countless battles, with eyes that had seen death and destruction on a scale most beings could not imagine. She did not seem happy about reporting to a human girl, but she respected Vorganth too much to disobey. "The darkness is real," Jin Wu said bluntly. "It is not a natural phenomenon. Something is causing this destruction, something intelligent and deliberate. If it continues on its current course, it will reach the galactic rim within a year. After that, it is only a matter of time before it reaches our worlds." HFY felt ice freeze in her chest. This was what Vorganth had feared. This was why he had demanded that someone learn Voshal. The precursor warnings had been real. The darkness was coming. She pulled up the precursor texts on her personal terminal and showed Jin Wu the warnings that the ancient civilization had left behind. The fleet commander studied the star charts, the descriptions of destruction, the accounts of entire civilizations being wiped out. When she finished, she looked at HFY with new respect. "The precursors faced this before," Jin Wu said slowly. "They knew about this darkness, but they are gone now. All of them. If they could not defeat it, how can we?" "They did not all perish. Heywan said, reading from the Voshal texts. The final entries in the precursor records describe something called the Ascension. The ancient civilization found a way to transcend their physical forms. They evolved into something higher, something the darkness could not touch. The records describe a theoretical framework, a method of elevating consciousness beyond the material universe. The three of them, Vorganth, Jin Wu, and Haiwan, began to work together. The Supreme Alpha made the decision to inform the Empire's leadership about the approaching threat. This was not done publicly, but privately, among the rulers and military commanders of the Kethner and their allied species. The reaction was mixed. Some wanted to mobilize the entire empire for war against the approaching darkness, even though no one fully understood what they would be fighting. Others wanted to flee, to abandon their worlds, and escape to the far side of the galaxy. But Vorganth proposed something different. He proposed that all the greatest minds in the Empire work together to understand the precursor technology, to unlock the secret of the Ascension before the darkness reached them. Months passed. Heywan found herself working constantly, studying ancient texts, consulting with scientists and engineers, trying to understand technologies that had been lost for thousands of years. She slept only a few hours each night. She ate quickly and without paying attention to her food. Min Su worried about her health, but she would not slow down. Too much depended on her. Commander Zorvas, despite his initial opposition, proved to be an invaluable ally. The great warrior respected strength, but he also respected determination. Haiwan's refusal to give up, her constant work despite the overwhelming odds, earned his admiration. He began to provide military resources to support Haiwan's research. He opened access to restricted archives. He sent his fastest ships to explore the galaxy for any remaining precursor technology or knowledge. As the years passed, Heywan realized that her life had become something far greater than she had ever imagined. She was not just the heir to an empire, she was the keeper of the galaxy's hope. Every decision she made, every piece of ancient knowledge she unlocked, could mean the difference between survival and extinction for billions of lives. Vorganth grew visibly older during this period. The burden of knowing what was coming, the weight of waiting for the approach of the darkness, aged the ancient Supreme Alpha. But he never complained. He worked alongside Haiwan, drawing on his ancient knowledge, his centuries of experience, his understanding of precursor history. One night, when they were alone in the great library, Vorganth took Heywan's small human hand in his massive clawed one. "You were the right choice," he said quietly. "I knew from the moment I saw you in the assembly, before you even raised your hand. I could sense that you were different. You think in ways that the Kethnir do not. You see connections that our warrior culture has learned to ignore. You bring fresh perspective to problems that have seemed unsolvable for millennia." Heywan felt tears forming in her eyes. "What if we fail? What if the darkness cannot be stopped?" "Then we will have tried with everything we have," Vorganth said. "That is all any civilization can do. We will have brought together the greatest minds in the galaxy. We will have worked as one unified force instead of as rivals and enemies. And if we do fall, at least we will fall knowing we fought with wisdom and courage." The approaching darkness seemed to accelerate. The probes sent beyond the galactic rim began sending back even more disturbing data. Whatever was coming, it was vast beyond imagination. It was not just a single entity. It was more like a wave, a force of nature, consuming everything before it. But Heywan and her team made a breakthrough. Deep within the precursor records, they found a complete description of the Ascension technology. It was not a weapon. It was a process, a way of transforming matter and energy into pure consciousness. If it worked, a civilization could escape physical destruction entirely. The problem was that no one had ever successfully built this technology. and they would have only one chance to do it. When the darkness arrived, they would need to be ready.